Well, greetings, everybody. This is your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown, and today we are going to be exploring the fascinating life of a very notorious New York City woman named Madame Restell. Was she the devil incarnate, or was she a saint? Well, this is our outline. What was going on in New York City in the middle of the 1800s? The arrival of the Civil War, and what was her role in the Civil War? Condemned by many, praised by others, viciously opposed by religious groups, sensationalized in the press with the rise of yellow journalism. And then, of course, the memory of Madame Restell. Not so well remembered today, but gives us a good insight into the situation in New York in the middle of the 1800s. So there's me in New York City again, preparing, researching for another exciting lecture. So let's get started in our discovery of Madame Restell. Well, New York City has long had a reputation as being rather sordid, even going back to the Dutch colonial times under Peter Stuyvesant and other governors. It was a trading city. It was a city of money. It was a city of brutal competition. Even before the stock market and Wall Street bankers went at each other, New York was a money city. Look at the seal on the right. The city was incorporated in 1625, founded the previous year. But look inside the windmill. There are two beavers and two barrels. Well, the beavers represent number one export of the Dutch and later English colony, beaver pelts for making boots and hats because the beaver was naturally water resistant. And on the right and the left are two barrels. No, they're not Dutch Heineken beer barrels. They were wheat. Corn and wheat were ground up into flour and then exported to the Caribbean islands in exchange for rum, which kept the city alive. So on the left, we see Peter Stuyvesant with his peg leg ruling the city with an iron fist. In the middle was the city hall, and we see the map on the right, a small town. By the time of the American Revolution, it only had 25,000 people, but it was a rough and tumble city of sailors, beaver trappers, Indians, people on a make to get as much money as they can. Well, the police log of the Dutch period and later English period show that all kinds of sleazy things were going on. It was a man's city. Very few respectable women were there. And so sodomy, men having sex with the Indians or with young boys, was a major preoccupation of all these sailors off of a ship for a week or so before they sail again. And so we see the arrest records. Nicholas Gregory Hildebrand of Prague case in 1658. Jan Quistholt in 1660, another case of death sentence for sodomy. Creoli executed 1646. Again, sex with Negroes, sex with young boys. It was a wild city. Well, the Duke of York, who took over in 1664 from the Dutch and turned it into the English-speaking city of New York, passed his laws. Number one was blasphemy, blaspheming God, premeditated murder, murder of a defenseless victim, conspiracy to murder. Well, then it goes on to bestiality. sodomy, man-stealing, slaves, all kinds of other laws. One law was, if a man layeth with mankind as he layeth with a woman. Again, a wild town, few respectable women, and lots of wild things going on. Well, Peter Stuyvesant tried to straighten out the city, going back to the old laws of the Dutch Reformed Church under its leadership and its inspiration from the Geneva reformer John Calvin. Crimes, men with men, burning at the stake, women with women, one of the rare notices of lesbian relationships in this period, strangulation, men with women, sex with animals, sex with oneself, sex with non-Christians. I mean, these Puritans, these Dutch Reformed, were vicious in rooting out sexual activities. This is a wall at the University of Geneva where I got my doctorate, again showing the fierce leaders of this Dutch Reformed and Puritan mentality. William Farel, John Calvin, who ruled Geneva with an iron fist, Beze, John Knox, who founded the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, as ruthless as John Calvin himself. Well, the Dutch really did what they could to turn this colony of New Amsterdam into a utopia. Christmas was banned. There is no December 25th in the Bible. They tried to outlaw alcohol with no effect. Mardi Gras, maypoles, plays, popular entertainment, knife fighting on the Sabbath. Any other day, evidently, it was okay. Commerce on the Sabbath, required attendance at the morning and afternoon Sabbath service. Only Dutch Reformed Church was allowed to have public worship. And in the middle, you see St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed Church in the middle of the fort. Sex with Indians and slaves was outlawed, but of course, from the police records, it was still going on. Governor Edward Hyde ruled the city from 1701 to 1708. Infamous transvestite. The picture on the left hangs in the New York Historical Society, the official portrait of Governor Edward Hyde. Well, transvestites in New York are as old as the hills. On the right, you see me in one of my get-ups, and below that, good old Rudy Giuliani dressing up in drag. Well, in spite of his love of women's clothing, Edward Hyde did everything he could to clean up the city. The Irish were already coming in, and everybody knows that you can't separate an Irishman from his whiskey. And the Germans were coming in, and who was making all the beer but the Germans? And so the city was declining in the eyes of many respectable people. The Lower East Side, Five Points, the Bowery, these were wild places. Well, along by the 1860s came the Civil War. City was growing in population. It was approaching 1 million by the time of the Civil War. People flooded into the city. Sailors were coming in on the Navy. The Brooklyn Naval Yard was building ships. Soldiers from New England and Pennsylvania, New Jersey were brought to New York for training. Money was to be made during the war. When the southern states seceded, well, New York became the center place for making uniforms, cannons, railroad cars, bridges, food, canning of food was inaugurated, ammunition, wagons, ships in the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and soldiers. New York was boom town, and money was to be made. Cannons were made in New York. The East River was filled with factories making iron cannons, iron for the bridges, for the early steel constructed buildings, guns and bayonets. Brooks Brothers was making the uniforms. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated wearing a Brooks Brothers suit. So New York was boomtown, approaching 800,000 by just before the Civil War. Well, immigrants were flooding in. Many of the Irish and German immigrants signed up for the army to get the bonus so that they could send the money back to Ireland and Germany and bring over the rest of their family. Industrialization, factories, textile factories. Well, along with all this came, of course, poverty, crime, drugs, prostitution. Hell's Kitchen, see the map on the right, was named appropriately Hell's Kitchen, an area of crime, of new immigrants, of prostitution. Well, Central Park was not Central Park. It was an area for training the troops. Today, you see the map on the left. Today it's called the Sheep Meadow because there were actually sheep there. Well, during the early Civil War, this is where the troops from all over the West and the Northeast, Pennsylvania, were brought to New York for training to become soldiers. Well, Madame Restell came to the rescue of these poor lads, torn from the bosom of their families, and brought to New York, trained as soldiers, and then marched off to the killing fields of the South. Well, these poor guys, when they were in New York, they were lost, and Madame Restell was there to entertain them. She was born in 1812 in England and died by suicide in 1878 in New York City. Her original name was Anne Trow. She arrived in New York in 1831. She had married a gentleman in England and had a daughter. Later married another gentleman named Charles Lohman, and her actual name had become Lohman, but in her rather radical and sexually free-thinking way, thought it best to adopt a name that nobody would recognize. And so she became known as Madame Restell. She was a believer in women's liberation. At a time when women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they couldn't have a bank account, they couldn't demand alimony from the husbands. If a woman got a divorce, the children went to the husband. Since he owned the house, he had the money, he had the skills and the employment. So along with other people like George Matsell and Robert Dale, she became a leading light of women's liberation. She supported a lot of the other liberation movements. She was against slavery, favor of women's rights, prison reform, building sewers in the city, which was polluted with sewage. Believer in fresh water being brought down from upstate New York in the Croton water system, paving the streets. Anti-Saloon League, limit the hours of bars and drinking establishments. Health reform, building public hospitals. This was an age of reform, 1820 to 1860. Of course, we all know about the reform to end slavery, but it involved a lot of other movements as well. We know Harriet Tubman opposing slavery, and people like Sojourner Truth advocating the right of women to vote. Some of the names we recognize: Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. These were the great reformers of the age. Walter Rauschenbusch, a German Lutheran theologian in the city, was a major advocate for the social gospel, improving society, improving the decadent city of New York. Books were being written by demanding population control, educating young people, informing young married couples on how to limit the birth of children. Back then, a woman was expected to be married in her late teens and produce a baby every year, since in the 1830s and 40s, half of the babies never survived to age 1. Well, Madame Restell was a firm advocate in various ways of controlling birth. She had advertisements for preventive powers, female monthly pills. She even endorsed surgical abortions. Now, of course, all of this was illegal at the time. Every child was a blessing from God, and so nobody should interfere. And the laws, 1827, 45, 72, clamping down on any abortion, any attempt to regulate the birth of children. She advertised in various newspapers for the ladies of female complaints, all these code words, female pills, talking to married women and single women on how to control their own bodies. So in the eyes of many people, she was a saint, whereas in the eyes of other people, she was a devil, advocating for human interference in God's plan for humanity. And there were many women who were offering remedies for women's issues. Most of them were quacks. Madame Costello had her female physician. But don't forget that at a time, women could not go to medical school. There were no women doctors who had an actual license. So they were quacks, and many of them were very dangerous. Her husband, Charles Lohman, and other people, such as Joseph Trow, ended up supporting her and together publishing all kinds of brochures. Now, of course, these brochures were illegal. A married woman's private medical companion. This was a kind of thing which was not permitted to go through the post or to be distributed freely. But they did publish things such as discover to prevent pregnancy, to prevent miscarriage or abortion, causes and mode of cure of barrenness or sterility. Very personal issues that Madame Restell was trying to bring into the domain of public discussion. Well, she was viciously attacked as scandalous, as immoral, sinful, a monster in human shape, and the wickedest woman in New York, largely coming from good, devout Christians who had no support for discussion of these personal issues or interfering with God's command to be fruitful and multiply. Well, she was also criticized because she was a very skilled woman businessman. On the left, you see her house, Fifth Avenue mansion, 4 stories, those little windows at the top. Those were always for the staff that was hired to maintain such a beautiful mansion. Her mansion was called the Osborne, completed after the Civil War at the height of her prosperity. She also invested in real estate, buying empty lots and selling them off as smaller lots to build mansions. All of this along Fifth Avenue, where the wealth that was created by the Civil War was taking over the Fifth Avenue street. Her house had the very first steam elevator so that she didn't have to climb stairs. Well, of course, as a very wealthy woman, she had her own carriage. She had a carriage house somewhat removed from the house where her men and boys took care of her stables, polished her carriages, and took care of her horses. So she was really one of these women who made a fortune during the Civil War and emerged along Fifth Avenue in a glorious mansion. She was an avid collector of diamonds and pearls, furs, an ostentatious carriage with 4 horses, and a liveried coachman. She would go riding in the newly constructed areas of Central Park. Of course, the trees had just been planted and it was still rather barren. But people like Mrs. Astor and the Stuyvesants and the other wealthy people who had made a fortune during the Civil War also went to show off their wealth. Well, of course, when Madame Restell would show up in her carriage, everybody looked the other way because they thought her ill-gotten wealth was to be despised. And of course, Mrs. Astor, who ruled Fifth Avenue with her list of 400 acceptable people, Madame Restell was never on her list. Bishop Huntington of the Episcopal Church published articles, published brochures and flyers condemning what Madame Restell was doing, accusing her of interfering with God's plan for humanity, even sanctioning abortion itself. And you can see from the pictures his fiery way of preaching and how he portrayed Madame Restell. Archbishop John Hughes, who was building his own Fifth Avenue St. Patrick's Cathedral right across the street from Madame Restell's mansion, condemned her viciously. These poor Irish families who were stuck with a new baby every 9 months. Listen to what Madame Restell was saying and tried to limit the birth of their children, sometimes even going as far as having an abortion. Of course, he had no good words for Madame Restell. Editorials, brochures appeared. Madame Restell and some of her dupes, how she convinced people to give her money so that they could learn how to manage their children. And she was viciously condemned as a quack, as duping people into giving her money for her information. Well, she was constantly being arrested. Accusations very often were brought, and even if they proved to be false, the police and the government had no hesitation on arresting her and taking her to jail. And of course, every activity, both before the Civil War, during and after, was widely reported in the press. On the left, you see trial of Madame Restell, alias Anne Lohman, for abortion. The press would report on visiting houses where they would uncover illegal abortion clinics. Of course, they attributed everything to Madame Restell's campaign to support family planning, as we would call it today. Anthony Comstock, shortly after the Civil War, became a major preacher of morality. Anthony Comstock, roundsman of the Lord, morals versus art. He was a vicious campaigner against abortion, against sexual liberation, against rights for women. And he passed the law that was eventually accepted by Congress in Washington, which made it illegal to send anything dealing with women's health or abortion or anything else through the post. It was denounced as pornographic. And so he became another great crusader against Madame Restell. The so-called Comstock laws, which were passed in 1873, made it illegal to discuss or distribute anything considered obscene by the government. Well, what is obscene? In fact, until today, the Supreme Court finds it almost impossible to define obscenity or to define pornography. And so anything under the Comstock laws dealing with women's sexuality was made illegal. So this was another weapon used by the government in this case to silence Madame Restell. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice condemned Madame Restell and called Comstock the weeder in God's garden. Comstock was going to pull out the weeds of pornography and of obscenity, and was responsible for numerous arrests of Madame Restell. The New York press reported on every incident in her many arrests. Here we see the New York Illustrated Times showing the one time when she was arrested. Of course, they didn't have photographs until after the Civil War, so these were illustrations which were put in magazines. Another one showing her in prison, being brought her meal for the day. She was repeatedly sentenced to the Tombs, which was today's Rikers Island, the great prison of New York. You can see it was called the Tombs because it was built like an Egyptian temple. The tomb still exists, and on the right we see the current incarnation of the Tombs. And she spent many a night in the Tombs. The press at that time was dominated by what they called the penny press. where a penny got you a newspaper. Competition was fierce. And in the yellow journalism age, each newspaper tried to have the most sensationalist headlines imaginable. That's what sold newspapers. Newspaper Row, which you see on the right, was a row of some of the major penny newspapers just across the street from City Hall, where you see City Hall in the picture on the left. And these were on what they called Newspaper Row. Newspapers were viciously competing. William Randolph Hearst was editor of the New York Journal. And he was the one who, many people say, drugged the United States into the Spanish-American War of 1890s, really forcing President Roosevelt to enter the war, occupy Cuba, and take over the Philippines and Puerto Rico and other islands. Here again, who destroyed the Maine, offering $50,000 reward, again selling newspapers. The National Police Gazette, the leading illustrated sporting journal in America, reported daily almost on crimes in families, robberies, murders, assassinations, and of course, the doings of Madame Restell. Articles, National Police Gazette, showing the female abortionist with the wings of the devil holding a dead baby. Look at that face. Definitely not in favor of Madame Restell. The Wonderful Trial of Caroline Lohman, alias Restell, Portrait of Madame Restell. Again, very often, newspaper articles and gazette articles were turned into freestanding brochures condemning her. Well, at the age of 66, on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1878, Madame Restell was found dead in her marble bathtub in her Fifth Avenue mansion. Well, of course, the press filled pages with stories of Madame Restell. Was she murdered by someone who opposed her work? Or was it suicide where her many sins became too difficult to bear? Well, the press, of course, had a field day. Well, she was buried in a private ceremony in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which is just up the Hudson River from New York City. Well, she had the money to get a plot and to be respectfully buried. You can see the monument on the left, where she is buried among leading New Yorkers. Vincent Astor and Brooke Astor of the Astor clan. Beekmans were buried there. Andrew Carnegie, Walter Chrysler, Samuel Gompers, the great labor leader and reformer, Washington Irving, one of the very first historians of New York City, William Rockefeller of the great Rockefeller clan, along with Louisa M. Alcott, another one of the early women writers of the city. So in death, she maintained her pride and had this dignified monument. Here again, until today, some people condemn her as the devil incarnate for going against God and God's nature. Others praise her as an early laborer for women's rights. So how we view her until today is one of these open questions. Was she a pioneer for the future of women's rights, or was she the devil incarnate? Well, the memory of Madame Restell is covered by many books. Many people say that she inspired universities to establish departments of gender, sexuality, feminist studies. The notorious Madame Restell, childhood and criminalization of abortion in 19th century America. Again, host of books dedicated to Madame Restell, Nicholas Serret, 19th century America's most infamous female physician, and the campaign by Comstock and religious leaders to make abortion a crime. She remains of interest until today. Many other books being written and considering her as a pioneer in women's rights. Loads of YouTube videos, the pioneer of reproductive rights and fight against censorship, the history podcast on Madame Restell, library lectures by people like me, Ron Brown, at the Washington Public Library, Facebook, all kinds of programs reviving interest in this fascinating woman. In New York Times, and not too long ago, this talked about the history of Madame Restell and the bringing the whole issue of abortion to the news. And of course, abortion remains a major issue today. Keep abortion safe and legal, and then I am pro-life. And so the issue remains very important. Was she a saint? Was she a devil? Well, even abroad, Madame Restell is again provoking interest as a pioneer for women's rights. Well, New York, in spite of all of these reformers, remains a pretty wild place. 42nd Street was one of the wildest streets in the city, with preachers preaching salvation against the sex workers on 42nd Street until Ayatollah Giuliani came along and cleaned it out. But in the eyes of many people, New York remains Sodom on the Hudson. 42nd Street, all kinds of stories about it. And it retained its reputation as a wild city. Midnight Cowboy portrays the gay life in Manhattan. Al Pacino cruising, flesh pots, scandalized poor Ayatollah Giuliani, and he did everything he could to straighten out the city, just like good old Peter Stuyvesant, but of course failed. So New York remains a fascinating city, a city still marred with its wild sexuality, of which Madame Restell is a very important part of this story. There's me standing at the front door of one of the more sleazy bars along West 14th Street. I won't tell you which one because it doesn't exist anymore. So, thank you for joining me for another exciting exploration of a less known chapter of New York City history. Thank you much. I shall see you